Yes, perfect. Thank you, Dr. Anderson. You are clear to go.
Thank you so much. And I know being able to hear what's being said is like so important. And because this is the moment in time, we can feel the energy. We can feel how we're on the precipice, and we can feel how the right to vote is hanging by a thread. And so that's what I want to talk about. I want to give us that perspective on the denial of the right to vote and the importance of the right to vote. And so I'm going to start off with a story because I'm a historian. It was 1946, and it was Georgia. And there was a Black man named Maceo Snipes, and he was a veteran, had just fought in World War II. And there was an election going on, a gubernatorial election in Georgia, a really important one. And so he was determined to vote. And he went to Taylor County, Georgia, to cast his ballot at the precinct. And there was a sign over the door that said, basically, the first Negro that votes, that will be the last thing he ever does. Maceo looked up and went, I fought fascists. What you got? And so he went in and cast his ballot because you know when you have fought in World War II, you're like, there's nothing you can do to me. So he cast his ballot and then he went home. And several days later, there was a knock at the door. And Maceo goes to the door and there's a white man there and he's like, could you come out? And so Maceo steps out the door and he's on his porch. And then he sees three more white men and then he hears, it was a firing squad. And they laid Maceo out. He went down on his porch, just bleeding, just bleeding. His mother ran out on the porch, saw her baby, and then basically dragged him to the only hospital in town, but it was a whites only hospital because this is 1946 Georgia. And they basically put him in a closet where he bled for hours until he could get some real medical care. It took Maceo days to die. But the message was clear because he was the only Black person to vote in Taylor County, Georgia in 1946. The message was clear. You vote, you die. You vote, you die. You vote, you die. And that's how we often think about Jim Crow disfranchisement in terms of the physical violence that rained down on Black folks who tried to cast a ballot, rained down on Black folks who dared to believe that they were American citizens. But I want to turn our attention to what I call bureaucratic violence, because it's that bureaucratic violence that does the enormous damage to democracy and to Black lives and to this nation and to the world at large. Because when our democracy is so weak, when it has been hobbled out, we feel the reverberations. So let me talk about that bureaucratic violence. And I'm going to start in Mississippi. And I know it's shocking that I'm starting in Mississippi, but I'm going to start in Mississippi. Mississippi, 1890, when we get the rise of Jim Crow, the power brokers in Mississippi looked up and they realized that there were more Black men registered to vote than there were white men, because at this time, women did not have the right to vote. So you have this racial imbalance in terms of political power. And they went, oh, we can't have this. And so what they did, I know this is going to be shocking, they started hollering voter fraud, voter fraud, voter fraud. And we must have election integrity. We must have election integrity. We've got to bring integrity back to the ballot box. We've got to bring confidence back to the ballot box. We've got to make sure that our citizens really have confidence in the sanctity and the purity of our elections. And so the way that they did that was by hollering voter fraud. It gave them the fig leaf, the cover, to basically disfranchise. But the 15th Amendment, which is one of the big constitutional amendments coming out of the Civil War, it was one of the Reconstruction Amendments. And it said that the right to vote shall not be abridged on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So Mississippi looks up and says, ooh, what are we going to do? Because we don't want Black folk to vote. But clearly, if we write a law saying we don't want Black folk to vote, that's going to run up against the 15th Amendment. And even this Supreme Court will say that's highly problematic. So how do we do this? Oh, I know. We're going to use the legacies of slavery. And those legacies of slavery will allow us to get around the bar against using race, color, or previous conditions of servitude. And what those legacies of slavery will do is it'll allow us to make this look like it's reasonable. So disfranchisement often looks reasonable, and it's often covered by the language of voter fraud. And so you put this big state interest up there and saying all we're doing is we're bringing clarity, sanity back to our elections, integrity back to our elections, and that reasonableness. The Mississippi Plan has several factors. One of them was the poll tax. And again, it will sound reasonable. Democracy is expensive. What it takes to be able to have poll workers who are counting, who are taking the ballots, others who are counting the ballots, and you have to have the ballots printed up, and you have to have a place where those ballots are counted. Holding elections are expensive. So if you really believed in democracy, you would be willing to pay a small fee in order to make sure that democracy runs. And so part of what you're hearing here is how the state does that linguistic gymnastics that turns the running of elections from the onus of the state, the responsibility of the state, onto the individual themselves. Because if you really believed in democracy, you would be willing to pay a small fee. But that small fee is not so small when you have had hundreds of years of slavery, hundreds of years of unpaid labor, followed by right after the Civil War, you had the Black Codes, which was reinstalling slavery by another name. And then when the Black Codes got dismantled, then you had sharecropping. So you had entrenched endemic poverty in that Black community. What the nominal fee for the poll tax amounted to was 2 to 6% of a Mississippi farm family's annual income. Imagine paying 2 to 6% of your annual income to be able to vote. That's not a nominal fee. That is a poll tax. The other thing, there was another element in the Mississippi Plan of 1890. It was the literacy test. And again, this is going to sound very reasonable. We believe that people who vote, who are voting on our policies, voting on our representatives, have to understand the bedrock principles of our great nation, have to understand our founding principles, have to understand why we are who we are. So we don't think it's too much to ask to be able to read a section of the Constitution. Now, again, I go back to the legacies of slavery. When the enslaved were systematically denied access to literacy, in fact, they were threatened, they were killed, they were tortured for being able to read. Literacy was forbidden. And then coming out of the Civil War, so you have hundreds of years of that. Then coming out of the Civil War, you have vastly unequal schools. Black schools were grossly underfunded, grossly underfunded. So when the state is requiring you to basically have a Harvard or a Stanford JD to be able to read the Constitution, but does not provide the resources for that to happen for the population, then what they have set up is an impenetrable barrier to access to the ballot box based on the legacies of slavery. And then there were these other methods in the Mississippi Plan. But what it created was an obstacle course to the ballot box. So if the poll tax didn't get you, then the literacy test did. If the literacy test didn't get you, then the good character clause did. If the good character clause didn't get you, then the understanding clause did. There were all of these hurdles that African Americans had to jump over to be able to access the ballot box. It was so effective, so that in 1890, when the Mississippi Plan first started, there were 190,000 Black men registered to vote. 2 years later, there were 8,600. 190,000, 8,600 in 2 years. That's the power of massive disfranchisement. And then you have the U.S. Supreme Court in 1898 blessing the poll tax and the literacy test from on high, saying that it doesn't violate the 15th Amendment because everybody has to pay the poll tax and everybody has to pass the literacy test. So this is not racially targeted. So one of the key elements in disfranchisement in this kind of post-civil rights era, in post-Civil War era, in this moment of the rise of Jim Crow, is learning how to write racially targeted, race-neutral laws. So race-neutral on their face, but racially targeted. And so once the U.S. Supreme Court blessed what Mississippi did from on high, the other states just followed through. They were just like, oh, that's the formula. So you see Alabama rewriting its constitution, Georgia rewriting its constitution, Alabama rewriting its constitution, massive disfranchisement. So much so, but by the time we get to 1942, when the U.S. is fighting Nazis, only 3% of African Americans were registered to vote in the poll tax states in the South. Now, understand, about 90% of the US's Black population lives in the South. When you've got, at that time, so when you only have 3% registered to vote, it tells you the power of bureaucratic violence. And what that also meant was that you had this kind of sense that voting isn't for everybody. And so in 1942, there was only a 7% voter turnout rate in those poll tax states. Let me say that again, 7% during a federal election for congressmen, senators, a federal election, a 7% turnout rate. Begin to think about the impact that has on the United States, because we often think of disfranchisement as being contained in these areas where it happens. But it redounds, it reverberates out through U.S. policy because of the rules of Congress that deals with seniority. The more you're able, the more you get reelected, the longer you're in service, the more seniority you have and the more power you have, the closer you get to chairmanships. And so once you're chairing the Senate Judiciary Committee, once you're chairing the House Appropriations Committee, you can put a stranglehold on the US's narrative of the world's greatest democracy, because you can block anti-lynching legislation, you can block anti-poll tax legislation, you can block. And that is what we're seeing. So that is what the power of disfranchisement does, not just to Mississippi and Alabama and Georgia, but to the United States writ large. So that is, again, part of what we have to understand. But coming out of that Second World War, if folks like Maceo Snipes are like, I fought for democracy, I'm going to get me some of it here. I want some of it. And they become part of the movement that will lead us into the civil rights movement. So when you think of Medgar Evers, he was a veteran. When you think of Hosea Williams, he was a veteran. When you think of L. Francis Griffin, he was a veteran. So you have veterans all over this movement. And that would lead us to the Edmund Pettus Bridge in 1965 in Selma. Hosea Williams was standing right there next to John Lewis as they were crossing the Edmund Pettus Bridge, because what they were dealing with was a point in 1960 in Dallas County, only 0.9%, not even a full percentage point, of African Americans were registered to vote in Dallas County, Alabama, where Selma was. And they have been protesting, agitating, and Alabama was not moving. And so there was a murder. Jimmy Lee Jackson was murdered by police for trying to protect his mother during one of these protest rallies. And so they decided to symbolically carry Jimmy Lee Jackson's body from Selma to Montgomery. So when these protesters are crossing the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and there's like 600 of them, nonviolent protesters, they are met by Sheriff Jim Clark on horseback with his deputies and the Alabama State Patrol. You remember the scenes from Bloody Sunday, the tear gas, the whips, the horses, the beatings. I mean, just folks getting trampled for believing that they were American citizens, for believing that they had the right to vote, for believing that the democracy that they fought for, that democracy should be fighting for them. And instead, what we saw was them being just trampled, just beaten senseless. But the cameras were rolling. And this was the era of television. And so when those cameras were rolling, what happened was ABC had its movie of the week, which was Judgment at Nuremberg. And they cut into Judgment at Nuremberg to show the footage from Bloody Sunday, the footage from the Edmund Pettus Bridge. That so shocked the nation, because they couldn't believe that these were nonviolent protesters who just wanted the right to vote, who just wanted to be registered to vote. And this is what happens. We're America. This is not who we are. What we're seeing in Selma is not who we are. And that protest, that kind of revulsion at the horrors on the Edmund Pettus Bridge would eventually lead to the power of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 was landmark legislation, because what it did is it flipped the script. Prior to that time, legislation would happen, and those states would just ignore it. They'd implement racist, discriminatory laws. Then you'd have to litigate, and the litigation would take years to resolve. And therefore, you would have election after election after election based on massive discrimination, based on massive disfranchisement, which would then lead politicians being put in place who had a vested interest in massive disfranchisement. What the Voting Rights Act did is it had what they called the pre-clearance provision. The pre-clearance provision said that these states that had a history of discrimination, and they had a formula to figure out which states and which jurisdictions had a history of racial discrimination, that they had to, before they could implement any election law, they had to get it pre-cleared by the U.S. Department of Justice or by the federal courts in D.C. So no more implementation of this mess. Now we're going to look over you. Now we're going to look over your shoulder. We're going to stop you. We're going to block you from being what I call a USDA grade A prime B fool. Stop this ridiculousness. Stop it. Well, that Voting Rights Act was powerful. In Mississippi in 1963 or so, fewer than 6% of African Americans were registered to vote in Mississippi. Yes, Mississippi, where you know there's some Black folk there in Mississippi. Fewer than 6% were registered to vote. 2 years after the passage of the Voting Rights Act, almost 60% of African Americans in Mississippi were registered to vote. That's what pre-clearance did. Pre-clearance changed the game. And so, as you can imagine, those who loved disfranchisement, those who were wedded to racial discrimination at the ballot box, they hated the Voting Rights Act. And so you kept hearing this language of voter fraud, voter fraud, voter fraud. And so I'm going to hop over and skip a bit. When we get to the 2000 election, we remember it for Florida and its hanging chads, Florida being unable once again to count ballots. They had the same problem in 1876. So here we are in 2000 and Florida can't count. And so this is where we go. This is what we think about. But I want to take us to Missouri. In Missouri, in St. Louis, the St. Louis Board of Elections had removed almost 50,000 voters from the rolls, but didn't tell the folks that they had been removed. And so they show up at the 2000 election to vote, and their names aren't there. The poll workers can't get in touch with the Board of Elections. And so the poll workers just send the people to go physically downtown to the Board of Elections to try to get back on the rolls. So you can imagine, as thousands of people are pouring into this office, it's chaos, it's bedlam. Stuff isn't moving. And so the Democrats sue because the polls are getting ready to close, and you still have people downtown trying to get back on the rolls. And so the Democrats sue, and the judge listens and says, yes, their inability to vote is not their fault. I'm going to keep the polls open until 10 o'clock. The Republicans said, oh, they're trying to commit voter fraud. This is the rankest attempt at massive, rampant voter fraud that we have seen in our lifetime. This is awful. This is awful. And so they go to another judge hollering voter fraud, voter fraud, voter fraud. And that judge agrees and shuts down the polls at 7:45. So that language of voter fraud resonated deeply, powerfully, and it had consequences because Senator Kit Bond, U.S. Senator Kit Bond, takes that language of voter fraud into Congress. And so as Congress is trying to figure out how do we instill confidence in the American people in our election system, particularly after folks saw the debacle in Florida, all of the mess that happened in Florida. I mean, hanging chads, the inability to count ballots, having police at checkpoint Charlie stations in the Black community as folks are trying to get to the polls. So they basically have to go through the police to be able to go vote. When folks saw all of that, so seeing that mess, they put, as Congress is trying to fix that mess in Florida to reinstill confidence, Kit Bond takes the lie of massive rampant voter fraud and puts it on par with the reality of what happened in Florida. And when I say the lie of massive rampant voter fraud, what he said is we had dogs voting. We had dead people voting. We had people who were putting on one kind of baseball cap and then using an address from a vacant lot and then coming back with a different baseball cap on, a different disguise, and then using another address from a vacant lot. We have massive rampant voter fraud. Where the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, and this is the beauty of local journalism. The St. Louis Post-Dispatch said, did we have massive rampant voter fraud? And started hunting, started looking. What they found is that there was a dog registered to vote. His owners thought it'd be really cute to register their dog as a voter. And that dog's name was Ritzy Meckler. But there's no evidence that Ritzy Meckler cast a ballot, nor did Rin Tin Tin, Lassie, or Fido. There is no evidence that any dog cast a ballot. There was, as much as the St. Louis Board of Elections had removed 50,000 people from the rolls, they had left a dead man on the rolls. But there's no evidence that that dead man cast a ballot. And those vacant lots, the city hadn't kept up its books. Those vacant lots had homes built on them. So that whole language about massive rampant voter fraud could not withstand the power of evidence, could not withstand the power of fact. But as long as you've got that narrative, as long as you've got that lie and you keep lying, you repeat a lie often enough, it begins to resonate. It begins to have the ring of truth to it. And so when you have it being said by respectable members of society, voter fraud, voter fraud, voter fraud. So we've got a US Senator hollering voter fraud, voter fraud. So what happened in the Help America Vote Act is you had the changes in the election system to deal with the mess in Florida. And you had the feds were saying states can require voter ID in order to deal with voter fraud. So now we have, again, the feds saying you can have voter ID to deal with the issue of fraud, even though there wasn't the fraud. And when I say there wasn't the fraud, there's also Justin Levitt, who is a law professor out of California. He did a study from 2000 to 2014. There were over 1 billion votes cast in the United States. That's billion, like Carl Saganish, billion votes cast. There were 31 cases of voter impersonation fraud out of 1 billion votes. It's like 0.00000000000. But that also becomes the basis for all of the laws that we will see come up. Those voter suppression laws. Then you had the election of Barack Obama. Remember that in 2008? And folks were like, did you see what we did? Lord, we just put a black man in the White House. That's not quite accurate, because part of what that is saying is that we have crossed the racial Rubicon. And so whites were really comfortable in voting in mass for this black man. In fact, whites had not voted for a Democratic candidate for president since 1964, since Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act. And so you might ask yourself, how did Obama get into the White House? Well, he had an incredible ground game. And his team, as an organizer, his team went out into the community and they registered millions upon millions of folks to vote. They were overwhelmingly African American, Hispanic, Asian American, young, and poor. That would become the hit list for voter suppression. In 2013, the US Supreme Court gutted the pre-clearance provisions of the Voting Rights Act, saying, oh, it's outdated. You know, America had racism in 1965. We don't have that now. So this law is archaic. It doesn't meet our modern standards. And I'm like, son, where are you living? We have had just the rise of these right-wing militias after Obama's election. Racism is a thing of the past. And they ignored the evidence. I mean, it's really hard to believe that you got Supreme Court justices who will ignore evidence, but they ignored the evidence of the reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act in 2006, where the US Department of Justice put before Congress that they had blocked almost 800 proposed changes to voting laws out of these pre-clearance states because those laws were racially discriminatory. And that wasn't from 1965 to 2006. That was only from 1982 to 2006. Over 800 changes to voting laws, proposed changes to voting laws, blocked because they were racially discriminatory. So how do we get from 2006 to 2013 saying racism is a thing of the past? But the US Supreme Court did. 2 hours after the Supreme Court ruled in Shelby County v. Holder that had gutted the pre-clearance provision, the state of Texas implemented a racially discriminatory voter ID law. And just the same way that Mississippi talked about voter fraud, voter fraud, voter fraud. And see, the poll tax is really reasonable. Voter ID laws sound really reasonable on its surface because it's like everybody has an ID. I mean, how hard can this be? Everybody has ID. And you want to make sure that people are who they say they are when they are casting that ballot. How hard is that? Well, the way that Texas wrote the law was that your state, university, and college ID, student ID, did not count, but your gun registration card did. Let me say that again. Your student ID didn't count, but your gun registration card did. So the way that you can craft what IDs are eligible to access the ballot box helps you craft who your electorate is. And what Texas also knew was that 1/3 of their states did not have a Department of Motor Vehicles. I'm sorry, 1/3 of their counties did not have a Department of Motor Vehicles. So folks were going to have to make basically a 250-mile round trip in order to get a driver's license. But if you don't drive, how do you make a 250-mile round trip to get the driver's license that you need to vote when the only other ID you had was your student ID? And understand how racialized those IDs are. So 50% of the students in Texas's colleges and universities are students of color. 80% of gun registrants are white. So you can racially craft by race those IDs. And again, it looks really reasonable on the surface, just the way the poll tax looked really. Alabama said you have to have a government-issued photo ID to vote. But your public housing ID doesn't count. Does it get more government issued than public housing? But in Alabama, 71% of those in public housing were African American. And for many, it was the only government-issued photo ID that they had. So this is how you can knock out a large segment of a voting population based on IDs. And so then Governor Bentley, listening to his mistress, Governor Bentley listening to his mistress, and that had to be some really interesting pillow talk. She said, baby, yeah, baby, you know what I want? What? I want you to shut down the Department of Motor Vehicles in the Black Belt counties. Okay, I thought you wanted something else, but okay. And so that's what he did, but he used the excuse, the subterfuge of making sure he had to balance the state budget because there was a deficit, and saying that these were units that didn't get a lot of traffic. And so in order to take away the cost of keeping those open, this was fiscally responsible. And everybody wants a fiscally responsible government. So he shut those down. What that meant then was that folks had to go 50 miles in order to get a driver's license. But Alabama is ranked 48th in the nation in terms of public transportation. So if you don't drive, and if you don't have access to public transportation, how are you supposed to get the 50 miles to get the driver's license that you need to vote? So again, this is how it looks so reasonable on its surface, right? Everybody has an ID, but you see how they begin to craft those IDs. What kinds of IDs can get you access to the ballot box, what kinds can. When North Carolina pulled this mess in something called the Monster Bill, the Fourth Circuit said you have targeted African Americans with almost surgical precision. Because it was so clear what was underneath all of that race neutral language was racially targeted laws to disfranchise the Black population. One of the other methods of voter suppression is going after early voting. Early voting makes sense because most folk can't get off on that Tuesday in November to go vote. By having early voting, it allows for basically working class folk to be able to access the ballot box. Well, the states figured this out. I'm going to take Indiana because this isn't just always a Southern phenomenon now. In Indiana in 2008, Indiana went for Obama. You saw folks basically clutch their hearts going, Lord have mercy, how did this happen? Don't you know we're Indiana? So what they did was they figured out what happened was you had massive early voting turnout coming out of the Black population in Indianapolis. And so they wrote a law saying counties that have more than 325,000 residents can only have one early voting site. Counties that have fewer can have more. Let me say that again, because I know that doesn't make any sense when it came out of my mouth. Counties that have more than 325,000 residents can only have one early voting site. Counties that have fewer than 325,000 can have more. There are only 3 counties in Indiana that have more than 325,000 residents. Those counties have Gary, Indiana, Fort Wayne, Indiana, and Indianapolis. Those 3 counties account for almost 70% of the state's Black population. So if you look at 70% of the state's Black population and reduce them to one early voting site, the impact was sizable. In the 2016 election, in Marion County, where Indianapolis is, Black early voting went down by 27%. Went down by 27%. In Hamilton County, which is a suburban county that was able to get more early voting sites, their voting turnout went up by 62%. So this is how you can rig the rules. You can, by rigging the resources, access to the resources. What they did in North Carolina, they looked at, what was it? I'm sorry. One of the big counties, Guilford County, I believe it was, and that had 22 early voting sites originally, and reduced those 22 early voting sites to 4 voting sites. So think about, you've got a big holiday and you go to the grocery store because you got to get some food, and there's supposed to be 22 lanes open and there are only 4. You know what those lines look like. And you know when you see those long lines, how you start doing a recalculation. I got to go pick up the kids. I got to go get this. I got to go get that. I don't know. I don't have time to wait. Long lines are designed to create voter disengagement, requiring people to just leave the voting booth. I don't have time for this. What they did in Ohio is say, we're going to be equitable here. Every county is going to get one early voting site. Aren't we equitable? Look how good we are. But Cuyahoga County, where Cleveland is, has over 1 million people, 1.2 million or so people in Cuyahoga County. In Pickaway County, with that metropolis, Circleville, they have 60,000 people in that county. So imagine one early voting site for a county that has over 1 million people and one early voting site for a county that has barely 60,000 people. In Hamilton County, where Cincinnati is, their early voting site had a line that stretched 1/4 of a mile. Again, creating long lines while trying to look equitable is designed to depress the Black voter turnout. It is designed to disfranchise. I know we're running close on time, so I'm not going to talk about gerrymandering, but know that it is lethal, absolutely lethal, because here you have politicians being able to choose who their voters are instead of their voters being able to choose who their representatives are. And it blocks movement on things that resonate, that are so important to the body politic. So if you want to know why we're not seeing movement on gun safety legislation, gerrymandering, the power of gerrymandering stops that. If you want to know why we're not seeing movement, real movement on climate change, gerrymandering stops that. And so it creates this massive divorce between the body politic and the representatives. Gerrymandering is lethal. Felony disfranchisement. Felony disfranchisement basically says if you have a felony conviction, you have lost your voting rights. And there were some places like Florida where the loss of voting rights was permanent. So let me back up. In 1867, Congress passed the Reconstruction Act that said that Black men can vote. In 1868, Florida passed its permanent felony disfranchisement law. 1 year after Congress says that Black men can vote, Florida passes its permanent felony disfranchisement law and then wrote the laws basically to only apply to African Americans, or basically to only be deployed overwhelmingly against African Americans. So you're seeing a racial imbalance in the criminal justice system, which then feeds into a racial imbalance in terms of access to the ballot box. By the time we got to 2018, there were over 6 million 6 million people who could not vote in the United States because of a felony conviction. 1.7 million of them were in Florida alone. 40% of Black men in Florida in 2018 could not vote because of a felony conviction. Over 20% of African American adults could not vote in Florida because of a felony conviction. This is worse than the 3/5 clause, because with the 3/5 clause, where they were counting 3/5 of the enslaved for representation in the census in order to figure out how many representatives they could get in Congress, here they're able to count the full body of the Black person and get that full body, but that person was not able to vote for their representative. So that was Florida in 2018. A group of activists got together and said, after people have served their time, they have paid their debt to society, let them be able to get their voting rights back. And they put Amendment 4 on the ballot. It was a citizen-generated ballot initiative. It passed by over 60%. The legislature looked up and said, oh, we're not having this. We are so not having this. How do we rewrite this? So what they did was they said, we're going to provide the language to define what is completing your sentence means. And it means not only have you served your time, not only have you finished your parole, your probation, but you have paid all of your fines, fees, and court costs. Well, folk looked up and said, Lord, that looks and smells like a poll tax, because I don't have to pay my income tax to vote. I don't have to pay my property tax to vote, but I got to pay fines, fees, and court costs to vote. And so that thing hits the courts. It goes up through the courts. And the court ruled, the federal court ruled, is a horrific ruling, that no, this was not a poll tax. They do have to pay their fines, fees, and court costs. And Florida doesn't have to tell them how much they owe. Now, so this becomes like the worst of the poll tax and the worst of the literacy test. So with the literacy test, the registrars, it wasn't always about being able to read a piece of the Constitution. The registrars could ask you an unanswerable question. In Mississippi, the question was, how many bubbles in a bar of soap? Mr. L., who was part of the village who helped raise me, he came out of Jim Crow, Georgia. His literacy test question was, how high is up? So Florida can ask you, how high is up? And when you can't answer an unanswerable question, it blocks your access to the ballot box. And so that is what the courts have ruled in terms of a felony disfranchisement in Florida. They're still working on it, but felony disfranchisement is highly racialized because the criminal justice system is highly racialized. One of the other pieces are massive purges, removing people from the voter rolls. And what happened there? and they have very subtle ways of doing it. I'm not sure what's happening here. Okay. Woo! Technology. And they have very subtle ways of doing it. So there was a thing called interstate cross-check that looked like it was all about databases. And so it said that it was a multi-state piece, like 27 different states. And if your name matched up, so it was your first name, last name, suffix, junior, senior, the third, last four of your social security, and your birth date. If those pieces matched up and you were registered to vote in Kansas and registered to vote in Virginia, they could kick you off the rolls. So it sounds clean, technology, sanitized, right? We love data, except that's not how it worked. How it really worked was that they really didn't pay attention to the last four of your social security. They didn't pay attention to your birth date. They didn't pay attention to the suffix, junior, senior. So senior looked just like junior. They barely paid attention to the first name. So Jose looked like Joseph. They really honed in on the last name. What that means is in the United States, the top 85% of the most common last names are held by minorities. So if your last name is Washington, there's almost a 90% chance that you are African American. If your last name is Hernandez, there's over a 90% chance that you are Hispanic. If your last name is Lee, there's over a 90% chance that you are Asian American. So by perseverating, by focusing in on the last name, they're able to remove folks by racial identity, but while looking really sanitized, while looking like this is a clean database. And so African Americans were overrepresented in the purges by 45%. Asian Americans overrepresented in the purges by 31%. Hispanics overrepresented in the purges by 24%. Whites underrepresented in the purges by 8%. Millions were removed from the rolls via interstate cross-check. And then there were the poll closures. And what the Brennan Center found was that since Shelby County v. Holder, in the Section 5, in the pre-clearance states, almost 1,700 polling places have been closed. The bulk of those have been in minority communities and have been in poor communities. 1,700 polling places. And the research is clear. For every tenth of a mile or a quarter of a mile, I can't remember, for every percentage of a mile that you move a polling place, Black voter turnout goes down by a certain percentage because of the distance that people have to go to get to the polling place. All of this led to, in the 2016 election, I don't know if you recall 2016, when that happened, the pundits were saying, well, you know what happened? Black folks just didn't come out and vote because they just didn't vote because they couldn't stand Hillary. Because they couldn't stand Hillary, Black folks just stayed home. So you had the racism and the misogyny all in that one kind of analysis. What they didn't do was to say this was the first presidential election without the protection of the Voting Rights Act. And these states have acted a stone cold fool since the destruction of Shelby County, since Shelby County v. Holder, with racist voter IDs, with poll closures, with massive voter roll purges, with eliminating early voting. They have done everything. These massive obstacles, just like the Mississippi Plan of 1890, that folks have to hop over to be able to access the ballot box. Black voter turnout in 2016 went down by 7%. And that 7% was determinative for that election in 2016. So where do we go from here? Grassroots organizations after 2016 really mobilized. And this is part of why we're seeing the change in our elections right now. We're seeing increased voter participation. Young folk are voting at a higher percentage than they had previously. And you're getting a pushback because part of the narrative is that voting is not a right. Voting is a privilege. No, it's a right and it is not an obstacle course. And we have the power to see to it that it stays that way, that it stays as a right and not an obstacle course. Thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you, Dr. Anderson. We're going to shift for those in Zoom, which will have an opportunity to have you participate in a question and answer. But prior to that, we have our esteemed Professor Peter Matthews of the Political Science Department at Cypress College. We have Dr. Lenore Medina of Fullerton College Anthropology, and also Candace Lynch, who she's going to be stepping in. She's outside with the books from our NOCE, which is the North Orange County Continuing Education Center, and of course our own Dr. Letcher, Annette Letcher from Language Arts at Cypress College, to consist of a panel that will ask Dr. Anderson questions. And again, we want to thank you for a provocative, informative, and most educational summary over suppression and history in regards to American voting politics. So if we can have Dr. Letcher, if you want to come up, Dr. Cadena, also, is he? No, yes. There you are. I thought you may have been on Zoom. And our own wonderful Sergio Banda, who's professor of sociology at Fullerton College.
Can we come up here? Okay.
Professor Virgil, can we really quick, just because of the sound, there's a little bit of either echo or they have difficulty hearing. So when we do just like a quick test, if people come up here and we're able to hear well, if not, if people can just chime in, our lead presenter on their laptop, that might be a little bit easier, or if they actually use their mic.
We're going to use this one to see how it works. So we can get Candace from outside. Right now, we're using a speaker here, but we want to see how that works. It was a little muffled before, so if they have the laptop, that's a little awkward, but we'll see how it's.
Just to run a quick test, because I know it's kind of multiple songs.
Yeah.
Can we all hear it?
I think that. If you like, yeah, you guys can hear us, correct? Yeah. Okay. Here comes. You want to come up here? You can. Come on up, Candace, if you will. Thank you. All right, so we're just going to go in order. Again, this is Candace Lynch, professor at our North Orange County Community College and NOCE, continuing education. So for better audio, we're using the not only the microphone but also the camera here. And so in succession, so Dr. Letcher, you'll be next, and then on Sergio, and then we'll have a question from Candace Lynch, Professor Lynch. So go ahead if you would.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to see you again, Dr. Anderson. Thank you for a very informative session. I wanted to ask you, what are some of the current examples of voter suppression you are seeing in this election? If you can comment on things that are happening in Florida, Texas, etc., some of the current issues.
Well, here in Georgia, and I do know why Ray Charles sings Georgia, Lord Georgia. We're dealing with the state election board has just been basically taken over by MAGA, and they've implemented some rules just a few days, so within 90 days of the election, basically saying that the county boards, if they think something is awry, they don't have to certify the election. Now, that goes against Georgia law and over 100 years of Georgia court cases that says that the certification is not discretionary, it is mandatory. But here, so think about, this is the place that where you had Rudy Giuliani talking about suitcases of ballots that led to his $148 million judgment, where he basically defamed two poll workers. But that narrative of suitcases of ballots has become part of the legend that something had gone wrong in terms of Fulton County. So if you have these kind of conspiracy theorists who are sitting there on our county boards of elections where they don't need evidence, where they just think something is awry, they can choose not to certify. And having a county choose not to certify then throws off the entire certification for the state, which then throws off the certification for the Electoral College, which then throws it into the courts or into the House of Representatives to determine who the president of the United States will be. So it takes the power of the vote out of the hands of the people. That's part of what we're seeing here. We're seeing as well additional hurdles for absentee ballots, because in the 2020 election, African Americans and Democrats used absentee ballots because of the pandemic more than whites and the Republicans had, by a large margin. And that large margin became determinative of the vote of flipping Georgia blue. There was no evidence of fraud, although that was the language that was used. Voter fraud, voter fraud, voter fraud. They actually did a hand recount in Cobb County, which is part of metropolitan Atlanta, a hand recount of the absentee ballots. Of 15,000 absentee ballots, they saw 2 that looked like something was a little hinky. When they investigated, when the Georgia Bureau of Investigation investigated, if my students wrote that sentence, I'm like marking it up. The GBI investigated. Those 2 actually were legitimate ballots. So of 15,000 ballots, no fraud. And in fact, coming out of the Secretary of State's office, the Secretary of State said there was no fraud with these absentee ballots coming out of these other areas. We're not seeing fraud. But that didn't stop them. So they put these additional hurdles on top of those ballots, as well as how hard it's going to be able to use those ballots. So again, shutting off the pathways that have been used in order to access the ballot box. That's what we're seeing.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. Anderson. Professor Matthews, I'm going to have you, since you're online, go right after we have Professor Lynch here in person. So you'll be
okay.
So, Dr. Lynch.
What a phenomenal presentation, Dr. Anderson. So everyone knows what me and my students already know, that you were just a phenomenal writer and researcher. And so my question is, I'm an English professor here at Cypress College, and we use your text, White Rage, the Unspoken Truth Behind Our Racial Divide. And so the students, they write a research paper and they look at some of the themes of your book. Reconstruction, Brown versus Board, and voter suppression is one of those. And, you know, as you're researching, you know, very important part of research, of course, is to make sure that the sources that you present are credible sources, right? And I always direct them to your text, that White Rage, that at least almost a quarter of that book is just your research. You're just a phenomenal researcher. And so you're looking at voter fraud, the lack of it, we have to maintain the integrity of the vote, purging the roll. So we're looking at a lot of misinformation. And so when students are doing that, doing their research paper, they have to wade through all of that information. Again, you were talking about, again, voter fraud, the integrity, purging. If you repeat a lie, enough people will believe it, right? And so I'm looking at that and having the students just sift through all of that information. And I'm thinking about, you mentioned about the dog registered to vote. And I just, and dare I would say that we had some misinformation in Springfield about eating dogs and cats. You know, I had to go there. Right, so that's misinformation, but if it's repeated enough, people will believe it, right? And so, just advice to my students, because there's going to be the research paper on your text is coming down the pipe about the 9th and 10th week of the semester. What advice would you give to students as they're researching and trying to sift through that misinformation? Because some of them will certainly do voter suppression. And so what advice would you give them to kind of sift through that information?
Be skeptical, but not cynical. Being skeptical, so you're interrogating your sources. Where did you get this information? What is the validity of this? What is the ideological bent of this information? What sources did they use in order to come up with this information? So you're interrogating all of your sources, and as best as you can, you're triangulating your sources. Where else are they finding this? Are they finding it in valid areas? What are the critiques of those sources? So because if you're looking at the critiques of those sources, and those critiques are like, whoa. So let me give you an example. The Heritage Foundation has said that there were they had thousands of examples of voter fraud on their website, where they're like, voter fraud is real. You know, they're saying that it's this fiction, but voter fraud is real. The Brennan Center looked at each one of those claims and explained what was happening with each one of those claims. So the Heritage Foundation, it looks like, oh, massive rampant voter fraud. But then having another organization come in and really explain its methodology, how it came to this is fraud, this is not fraud, this is fraud, this is not fraud, and this is why. You're like, wow. So interrogate your sources, be skeptical, but not cynical, and understand what are the biases of those sources.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Right, we have our next panelist, Professor Sergio Banda, sociologist at Fullerton College.
Good morning. My name is Sergio Banda. I'm in the sociology department at Fullerton College, and I want to thank you personally for being here, and what a great presentation. Unfortunately, one of those problems that continues to be a big issue. And you touched up on a lot of things, especially what's happening historically with not only voter fraud, but more specifically, intimidation. Now, is there anything that you're aware of that's happening in the Southwest, more specifically in California, something similar that we can, that perhaps we're not aware of, that you can share with us?
One of the things that I would look at, I don't have anything specific, but something to look into, is to make sure that the ballots are in the appropriate languages, so that if you have a region that has a large percentage of, for instance, Hispanics, or a large percentage of Asian Americans, the ballots are supposed to be in the language of that group, because the language barriers are a way to block access to the ballot box. So here we have Gwinnett County, which is the most diverse county in Georgia, and it is really, truly diverse. And one of the things that Gwinnett had been running into was that it did not have ballots in Vietnamese. It did not have ballots in Korean. It did not have ballots in Spanish. It only had the ballots in English. Well, when you have a very diverse voting age population, registered voter population, then those folks can't access the ballot box. So that's one of the things that I would look at in terms of access. And I have to say that California did a really good job of having pre-registration for 16 and 17-year-olds, because that is the thing that North Carolina, in its monster bill, got rid of. North Carolina used to have the 16 and 17-year-olds were pre-registered to vote, so when they turned 18, they were automatically registered, and got rid of it because remember how I talked about the Obama coalition? part of that group are young folk. And so if you can make sure that young folk are dissuaded from voting, you can basically have the kind of massive disfranchisement that you want. Voter suppression. Yeah.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
All right, thank you so much, Professor Banda. And then we have Professor Candace Lynch from our North Orange County Continuing Education with a question.
Thank you so much, Dr. Anderson, for being here. It's been amazing to watch you speak. What I wanted to ask you about was our local school board elections. Those have become really hotbed elections, and in Southern California, we're seeing a lot of people coming in kind of trying to take over our school boards for their own political gains. And I don't know if you're seeing that in other parts of the country. I'm sure we are, but can you speak to that problem, those little elections, the smaller ones that people think aren't important, that are really so pivotal?
Absolutely. When you think about how so much of where we live has to deal with what's happening at the local level. So what's happening with our mayor's office? What's happening with our school boards? What's happening with our city councils? What's happening with our zoning boards? What's happening with our state legislatures? And so we get all focused in on the presidency, and we miss what's happening at the lower. So when they talk about voting down ballot, that's what they mean, really paying attention to what's happening there. And so Moms for Liberty came in and just took over a lot of school boards. And then you started getting these massive book bans, so where you can't teach The Diary of Anne Frank. You can't teach Beloved. You can't teach The Bluest Eye. I mean, so major books in the canon are now verboten because of Moms for Liberty, these book bans. And so part of what I've been seeing, though, are that when that happened, when people realize what's happening in their schools with their children, then they begin to organize for the next school board election to get those folks off of the school board and away from their children. So it really takes engagement. That's part of the real key with democracy. It requires engagement, consistent engagement, and figuring out what's really important. And so, and it hurts to say, but all of it is important. So what happens in our city council? What happens with our, what do they zone? Where do they zone? Where do they choose to put the trash burning pit? Where do they choose to allow different types of housing to be built? Those sorts of things. So paying attention to what's happening at the local level, knowing who's running, also paying attention to the judges. We elect our judges. Paying attention to those judges' opinions on things. So part of what we saw in Wisconsin, there was a massive takeover in Wisconsin that, we think of Wisconsin as basically like the founder of progressivism. There was this massive takeover in like 2010, 2011 that had massive voter ID, that got rid of organized, public unions, that got rid of. And part of the way that they were able to get rid of was because they had control over the state Supreme Court. Then folks started mobilizing, organizing, and having people understand the power of the courts in being able to shape what you can and can't do. And part of that mobilization led to a key victory for the Wisconsin Supreme Court that then tilted the balance there so that the gerrymandered districts were no longer acceptable, so that the public unions could now become real again. I mean, so it's that kind of stuff, paying attention to who the judges are, what their previous positions have been on key issues.
All right, thank you so much. We have on Zoom, virtual land, our own esteemed and we'll say prolific, not only political scientist, but also has run for office for the county and state, So Professor Peter Matthews of our political science department, who has a question, but also maybe a comment as well. We have some time for that. So Peter, we'd like to have you as a content expert. Please ask your question if you have any commentary to follow.
Thank you so much, Dr. Adams, and thank you, Dr. Anderson, for this prolific and magnificent presentation. It's good to see you again after a few weeks. You're so inspiring. Your book is amazing. I've looked into it and using it for source work. I'd like to quote Joseph Stalin at this time, if you don't mind. Of all people, Joseph Stalin, the most anti-democratic dictatorial leader of the world, in the world. He said, it's not who votes that counts, it's who counts the votes.
Yes.
Okay, so voter suppression is a way of actually determining who will actually count which votes. Am I right? And that's what's going on here. And back in 1876, doctor, as you mentioned, the election between Tilden and Hayes, President Hayes and Samuel Tilden, was one in which an electoral college dispute. In the end, the two parties made a deal. They compromised behind the scenes, made a deal to say, okay, Mr. Hayes, you can keep those electoral votes so you can become re-elected president. But we, the Democrats, who was Tilden's party, Southern Democrats, that's when the party was led by and run by racists, right, all the way. Tilden said, his people said, you can keep those electoral votes, you can be president again, Mr. Hayes, but we want something from you. We want you to remove those troops, the Union troops, out of this area. This is our country, our part of the country. We'll take care of our people. We'll take care of our voting, and all hell broke loose after that. All hell in terms of the suppression of the votes. So I'm just asking you, has something happening today where we're seeing not exactly the same replay here, but something similar to where there's a concerted effort since the Supreme Court ruling against this 1965 Voting Rights Act to actually ensure that many people will not vote, who tend to vote for one party over the other. And what is the major threat to the election, the possible election of Vice President Harris in this regard, in the Harris and Trump contest? The states are the swing states are so close right now. Just a few thousand votes either way could tip the election one way or the other. So all these methods of voter suppression have been brought up to us. It's so important what you're doing right now. I'd like you to touch on that specifically on this election and where it could be these things occurring to ensure that only one candidate will get elected, not the other. Meaning trying to ensure that former President Trump will get elected rather than our Vice President, Kamala Harris. Could you touch on that, please?
So I'm going to come back to Georgia.
Okay.
Because when Trump was here, I'm sorry, and I lost my poker face at 31. So when he was here, he actually praised the 3 members on the state election board, and he called them his pit bulls.
Yeah.
And shortly thereafter, they began to issue those rulings in terms of certification of the election. And one of the other pieces and I don't think this one has gone through yet because there's been a lot of pushback. They wanted to require county boards of election to hand count the votes on election day. Well, you can't start counting the votes until after the polls have closed, which is 7 p.m. When you look at Fulton County, which is part of Atlanta, has 750,000 registered voters. I forget the other county's name. One of the smaller counties has like 1,200 registered voters. So imagine being required to count, not that you're going to get full turnout, but at least 500,000 ballots by hand between 7 and midnight. Or what that means if you only have to count like 1,200 or 800 between 7 and midnight. And the state is not giving those counties any additional money. So they can't like hire people. So one of the things, SB 202, which was the voter suppression bill that Georgia put in place after the 2020 election, one of the things that it did was it banned the use of outside money because the pandemic required all kinds of stuff to happen. And Georgia was like, no, we're not giving you any money. And so Zuckerberg's organization said any county can apply for money. The big counties did. The smaller counties did not. And so the state legislature looked at that, said, that's unfair. That's unequal. And so no outside money. And so you get these requirements to be able to leap these, tall buildings in a single bound without the resources to be able to do so. And so I think about the kinds of pressures that we're putting on our election officials to be able to run free and fair elections when you have a malevolent force that does not want free and fair elections and will penalize them for trying to do the work without the resources. So that's what I see happening. And I think about what's also happening is the threats of violence raining down on our officials, and how you've had massive number of folks who have the experience in terms of being at the polls, basically resigning because of the threat of violence that comes in from the right wing. So that's part of what's real, and the refusal to acknowledge that threat of violence as real. That I think is also really destabilizing. Yeah. So yeah, and that quote by Stalin was absolutely pitch doggone perfect. When we were playing cards, we used to say, "He who has the pen wins," and that's exactly what that is. So I get to choose how the count goes, and if I don't like these votes, they're not getting counted. And this is why folks are talking about we have to turn out where it's too big to rig. We have to have this massive turnout where it's just like the tsunami coming in, that makes it very difficult to find 11,780 votes. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. We're going to transition to the audience, but first I, even as the moderator or facilitator in this case, have a question I'd like to ask for you also, Dr. Anderson. And it has to do with the Obama election. The first term, he was successful in the under 25-year-old vote with a 66% margin, which was unprecedented at the time. And his second term, it went down to 60%. Still won, but it was a decrease in the amount of under 25-year-olds that were participating in voting. Now, today we have the Orange County Registrar of Voters out to elicit those who have yet to vote, but we're looking at a potential decline of the under 30. And so my question is, moving forward, how might we invigorate or give them a certain sense of urgency with this very tight election that is pending in some less than 50 days? What encouragement or strategy would you suggest that they or we encourage to get that high level of participation with our young population?
I'm going to go back to a chapter I did in One Person No Vote where I talked about Alabama and that special election in 2017 between Judge Roy Moore and Doug Jones. And Black Voters Matter. Alabama had used every method of voter suppression against its Black population, every method. Black Voters Matter went in there and didn't say, hey, it's really important that you vote. They began to ask people what they wanted in life.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and so folks started talking about, I want to be able to send my baby to a good school. I want to be able to have clean drinking water. I want to be able to have, I don't want to be able to have a fecal lake behind my house. I want a real sewage system. Wow. You know, so when people started talking about what they wanted, then Black Voters Matter was talking with those folks about how in being engaged in the electoral system can get them to that spot. So first you have to listen to what people are saying. You have to engage them. It's not saying you must vote. It is saying, what do you want? You know, I want the planet to not burn up. I want, you know, I want to be able to pay off my student loans. I want to be able to afford a house. I want to be able to have decent health care that I can afford. I want to be able, when I get sick, I don't want to have to go bankrupt if I get sick. I mean, it's just like listening and then figuring out how you talk about public policy, how policy then ties in to those wants. And I think that becomes essential. It's like listening to what they want, listening to what's important to them, and then making the connections.
Thank you very much. I appreciate, eloquent as we would expect, nothing less, and informative, as I've mentioned. So I thank you on behalf of the panel, of experts, content experts, and their particular disciplines. And not to make it any less, we want to open up for you, the audience, either in Zoom. We have some questions already stacking up, but also the watch party here. So get yourselves prepared to engage. Please do not just be a non-participant observer. So first we have Maha Afra, who is our dance and performing arts professor, with a question, and then second by Marco Guzman. So Maha, if you can unmute and ask your question, please. And we're limiting the question, so we'll have maximum of time for response by Dr. Anderson.
Okay, can you hear me? I'm sorry, I'm driving to work.
Be safe, but we can hear you.
Okay, so thank you so much, but this is a question about the now. For people like me, how is our system, election system, democratic and has integrity when you have lobbies like AIPAC deciding elections, when the pro-Palestinian humans are stuck in a place where both candidates are vying to who supports Israel the most. And we are stuck in a two-party election system where we are pressured to cast a vote for Kamala Harris, who has deliberately shut down our voices and who publicly reiterated lies that they were debunked. So can you please address this for our communities? Thank you.
I will try.
Thank you.
So one of the things, so I think there are two things there. One is about our two-party system. And I know it frustrates the bejeebers out of folks. But when you have a third party that only shows up for the presidency and hasn't done the groundwork to build the structure of a viable party, then that third party only coming in every 4 years really looks more like a spoiler instead of a viable party. So what I mean by building, so are we seeing that third party running candidates for school boards, running candidates for mayor, running candidates for city council? So the reality is that this is a two-party system until we can get that third party that really is willing to do the kind of groundwork to build. The second piece is I think about what AOC said. And she said, we have to think about under what administration will we have the ability to fight for, to organize for, to advocate for. And so when you begin to look at what that structure looks like, that structure is not Donald Trump. It is so not Donald Trump. And I know we're supposed to be like neutral on this, but it is so not Donald Trump. And there's more ability to advocate for with the Democrats and with Kamala. And so because that is where we are, that is our reality, and because no third party has come up to be able to develop a really powerful structure enough, instead they look more like a spoiler. So I think about RFK's run, Jill Stein's run, looks more like spoilers. That's where we are. And we have more folks who sit out from elections than who actually vote. And that has helped create the kind of entrenchment that we see. So if we get the people voting, politicians listen to not just to the folks who have the money, because the folks who have the money only have so many votes. They listen to the folks who vote for them. And so if we can get folks out who are advocating, and holding folks accountable, then we're going to begin to see those policy shifts. But sitting out means that you're not going to have the leverage.
All right, thank you so very much. And we're going to continue with questions that have a little bit out of order. I mentioned Marco going second, but I want to give an opportunity for Professor Jody Balma at Fullerton College. She was also intended to be one of our in-person panelists, so I'm glad she was able to make the meeting here. So go ahead, if you would, Professor Balma, with your question.
I really appreciate it. I'm actually supposed to be in another meeting, and I found you so incredibly engaging that I told them I couldn't go. So I really appreciate your presentation, and I love that it's going to be recorded for students to watch. I just wanted to amplify what you said. I think it's important, and then I do have a question for you. But California is on the opposite end of the spectrum for voter suppression. We have mail-in ballots sent to every registered voter. Our Secretary of State, who you may know, Dr. Shirley Weber, is a phenomenon on voter access and making sure that voters have access in their language. Orange County in particular has a registrar of voters who is incredible at making sure that that has integrity. We do need young people to vote. In November of 2022, the midterm elections, where the House of Representatives is controlled by Republicans currently, and they are talking about the SAVE Act of voter ID and all of those things. Orange County, California, young people did not show up. 72% of all ballots were cast by voters over 50 years old, which means because old people in California are white, 69% of all ballots cast were by those who are white in a state that is plurality Latino. So I just want that for the record, and I so appreciate you. But I want to know, in Georgia and in so many of the historically Black colleges and universities, having a sorority member on the top of the ticket for the first time ever, what effect do you think the Divine Nine are going to have on voter turnout? I know one of my dear friends said, I am bringing every Black man to the polls with me or they get no gumbo. And so I'm expecting a surge in Louisiana just for Dookie Chase's family.
Well, again, I'm going to go to Alabama during that 2017 special election. And there, multiple organizations got involved. Key were the Divine Nine and the work that they were doing on those college campuses, and getting young folks registered to vote and getting them to the polls, getting them out. They have incredible organizations, incredible networks, and I see them fully engaged. The Divine Nine, as well as the HBCUs, fully engaged. So it's, and I know it's going to be close. And I'm going to say the reason why it's close. I wrote a piece in The Guardian several years ago to explain Donald Trump. And I said, he didn't have governing experiences. So this was in 2015, 2016, when he was first launching his campaign. And I said he didn't have governing experience. He didn't have policy-making experience. What he had was a kilo of pure, uncut white supremacy that he put on the table and said, snort. And that was birtherism. The denial of Barack Obama's legitimacy as an American citizen, snort. And then the next kilo was Mexicans are rapists and criminals, snort. Then the next kilo was Muslims are terrorists, snort. Then the next kilo, then the next kilo, then the next kilo. So that is his shtick. That's where he runs. And like any addiction, folks are heavy on it, and they think they're strong, they think they're powerful, they think they're doing everything that they're supposed to do. But in fact, it's destroying them, it's destroying everything around them. And that's why it's so close, because you've got this addiction to that kilo. And I don't, so that addiction to that kilo makes it really hard to say, oh, you need to get off of that. You really need to get off of that. Yeah.
Thank you very much. You defied, unfortunately, Jody, if you feed them, they will come. So we want to definitely have that gumbo. We're going to defer to, again, online, and then we'll go to our participants here in person. But Marco, and then followed by Eddie Garcia. So Marco Guzman, you have a question.
Yes, first of all, Dr. Anderson, thank you for this webinar today. It was very informative and enlightening. My question is about my state in California. We're definitely reliably blue, but is there any history or any current instances, maybe since 2000, of maybe some suppression in the more rural counties where there's probably a lot of more Hispanic voters?
There probably is. I don't know of it. And my probably is because of, so I think about what Texas is doing to Hispanic voters. So it was 2019, I believe it was, when David Whitley, who was the acting Secretary of State, held this press conference, and it was so McCarthyish, Joseph McCarthyish. In my hands, I have a list of 95,000 non-citizens who are registered to vote, and 58,000 of them have already cast a ballot, and I've turned their names over to the Attorney General of Texas. And then so Trump, tweets in, yeah, I knew voter fraud. This is why we have to have voter ID. This is why we have to have voter ID. Well, it turns out that those 95,000, that the list that they used was fundamentally structurally flawed. And they were told it was fundamentally structurally flawed. It was the Department of Motor Vehicles list. And where people may have been immigrants at the time, but they have since become naturalized citizens. And once they became naturalized citizens, they registered to vote, and then they cast a ballot. And so what that is saying, and then they ordered the counties to start purging those folks off the list. And so was it Harris County where Houston is? And so they started going through the list, and they found that most of those folks that they were looking at that they were told to purge were actually naturalized citizens. And so what put folks on that list was not that they were naturalized citizens, but it was that they had the doggone audacity to believe that they were American citizens with the right to vote. And how that sends the signal: if you keep your head down, if you don't vote, then you won't have the criminal justice system pounding down on you, having the Attorney General have you on a list saying we're coming after you for voter fraud. And then there was in 2017, I believe it was, in North Carolina, where Jeff Sessions, who was the U.S. Attorney General, teamed up with ICE and demanded that counties that had sizable Hispanic populations in North Carolina basically disgorge their voter rolls and voter data to ICE and to the DOJ. Now think about again how this sends the signal of terror, of fear, of intimidation to that population. So if I'm voting, I'm on that list. If I don't vote, I'm not on that list. And so that has been a standard practice that I have seen over and over and over. It's frustrating, it's annoying, and what has to happen is that we have these organizations that then fight back. They take these states to court. They take these government officials and basically expose them for the mess that they're doing. So, like, I don't know exactly what's happening in California, but I have seen Hispanic populations targeted in other states in those ways.
Thank you. Thank you.
Mhm.
Thank you very much. Again, Dr. Anderson. We have time for one additional in the audience on Zoom, and then we're going to defer with time remaining about some less than 15 minutes for our audience here present. So Eddie Garcia, question.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for all the great information, Dr. Anderson. So as a first generation Mexican American, you grow up thinking, oh, your vote won't matter, your vote won't matter. It doesn't matter, you don't have to do it. And then so my question, and it kind of might go in a couple different ways. I'm sorry about that. When it comes to the felony disenfranchisement, if I got a couple of felonies back to back, like over 20 years ago, where do I find out the information if here in Southern California, there are activists, organizers, or um, advocacies that I can go to and find out if I can get my voter rights back? And if not, like, do I need a lawyer? What would I do? Because just these past couple, maybe even 3 elections, it's just been more and more important to really get out there. So I just feel like as I get older, although young people should get in there and vote, like everybody is saying, it's just really important, and you can see it. You can really see it. So I want to do my part, but when it comes to felony disenfranchisement, it just I feel like that's a big hurdle that I haven't been able to get over.
Okay, so one of the things you want to do is, and I'm not a lawyer, although I play one on TV. So one of the things you want to do is go to the Secretary of State's office and on its website and see whether California has felony disfranchisement and what its parameters are on that. Because there should be a process. If it does have felony disfranchisement, there should be a process that's laid out on how you gain your voting rights back. The other thing is to find an advocacy group like the ACLU that works on this issue. And so finding one of those organizations. So the first thing to do is to gather the information on felony disfranchisement in California from the Secretary of State's office. The second thing to do is figuring out what that process is, and then finding the organizations in California that work on that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
We're gonna now have those on Zoom go ahead and remain muted with the exception of our speaker or keynote. And Jody, if I could have you wait just 1 second. We'll see if I can grab a participant in the audience who would like or has a question. Please raise your hand. Yes, and speak nice and loud, and then I'll repeat it for those in Zoom.
Hello, thank you for allowing me. I want to say thank you, Dr. Anderson, for this presentation. It was an honor to be able to listen. Hearing everything we had to talk about, Donald Trump specifically, made me think back to my history government class back in high school last year. We were talking about Donald Trump's election and everything, and one of the major points that my classmates were making were, what if we just let Donald Trump win again? So we wouldn't be able to elect to run again, because he's been running for presidential election ever since I can remember. I can remember back in in elementary school. I can't remember the exact grade, but coming back from knowing that he won and having the fear of my fellow classmates and my community members getting deployed, or like, I specifically remember in classroom, like, it's going back to like, it's like astonishing, like we're literally divided, like we were dividing ourselves. So like, oh my God, we're gonna get deported. They're not gonna get deported. But then our teacher was reminding us, like, no, like that's not how it works. But like we were little kids, and like that's how we felt. Like, so it's like, I just want to talk about that. Like, what are your opinions on that? Like, I know some people want to say like.
Let me ask you then, is the question in summary, should we let Donald Trump win so he has now a 2-term office, so he would be ineligible for the future? All right. Go ahead, Dr. Anderson.
Okay, so yeah, that's what I thought I heard. The answer is no, absolutely, positively not. No. So I'm going to go all Amy Winehouse. No, no, no. There's this thing called Project 2025 that is the blueprint for Trump's second term. Project 2025 is absolutely lethal to American democracy, to folk of color, to our way of being. And what it means is once he's ensconced, he's not leaving. And just remember that the US Supreme Court just basically gave him pure immunity for anything that he does in office, because that becomes an official act. And so under Project 2025, what he wants to do is to round up somewhere between 11 to 20 million, what he says are undocumented immigrants, and deport them, and to send the US military into what he calls Democrat-run cities. and have that deportation happen. And he said, and it's going to be bloody. Now, I think of when he talks about deporting, he doesn't mean deporting folks who look like Melania. He's talking about deporting folks who are brown and who are Black. And how will he tell who's undocumented? It reminds me of the Joe Arpaio mess down in Arizona, driving while brown. So that what it's going to do is that the probable cause is your skin tone. And so are you going to have to walk around with your papers at all times, proving that you are naturalized, you are a citizen, so that you don't get deported? Absolutely not. And getting rid of there are other elements in there that are just absolutely horrific with Project 2025. And he's made it really clear when he told he was speaking before a group of evangelicals. And he said, all you got to do is vote this time and we'll have it fixed. And so you won't have to vote again. Boy's not planning on leaving. Boy's not planning on there being another 4-year term for him. Boy's planning on ensconcing himself as Viktor Orban, as a dictator. That's his goal. That's his plan. So no. You don't give in to abusers. You don't give in to sociopaths. You cut them off at the knees. You stop them cold. And that's what has to happen here. That's why we have to vote, because his plan for us is absolutely horrific.
Thank you. Jody, I'm going to come back and let you follow up on, I believe, a question I was asked earlier.
I just want to be Dr. Anderson's research assistant here for California law. So Proposition 17 that we passed does allow formerly incarcerated folks to vote. And so, Eddie, you should absolutely register. And if you happen to be a Fullerton College student, help us with the ballot bowl, where the community colleges compete to get people registered to vote. I put it in the chat, but anybody who's just watching this, I just wanted to make sure they know that you are absolutely welcome to vote. And we need your voice on reforming our criminal justice system. So please do.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
All right. Thank you. Another question from the audience, Dr. Thompson.
Dr. Anderson, thank you for being here. Can you comment about, is our greater issue now voter suppression or voter apathy?
Understand that the goal of voter suppression is to create voter apathy, to make people think that it doesn't matter if I vote. My vote doesn't count. The system is what the system's always going to be. And so I have no real input in this. I have no real say. That's what voter suppression is designed to do. And so what they know, for instance, is that voting is habit forming, as is non-voting. And so if they can create in a community non-voting as a habit, then the work is done. So that is why the long lines, that is why the extra hurdles, the obstacles that folk who are just trying to handle their business are having to jump over. And it's like, I can't come back again for another 6 hours. I can't find this piece of paper. And so the apathy, the voter suppression is designed to fuel the apathy and to make folks believe that they have no power, no agency in this system. So I wouldn't even call it apathy. I would call it a sense of powerlessness.
Thank you very, very much. Again, well thought out, very much explanatory. And folks, we're down to the last question. I'm going to have you hold 1 sec. We've had one in Zoom, even though I love you that you're here, but had his hand up for a minute. And so I want to, again, be brief on the question, if you would, so we can make sure we have a full explanatory answer. But Kasim, if you would, yes, question.
Yeah, hi, Qasim Ali Mohammed. Love the presentation. I thought it was absolutely wonderful. I posted my question earlier up in the chat. I was wondering about specific areas where, even at the local level, where we have our voices sort of excluded. And for one particular group here at Cypress campus, the adjunct professors, we find our voices consistently sort of demurred, if you will. I was wondering if you could share any tactics with us in order to help us get our voices better heard on a campus that consistently marginalizes smaller professors' voices.
Organize. One of the things I do is I teach the civil rights movement. And with that, so let me back up. I went to my class and I said, okay, you're in Mississippi. It's 1950s Mississippi. Your mayor hates you. Your police hate you. Your city council hates you. The judges hate you. Your state representatives hate you. Your US senators hate you. Your congressman hates you. What are you going to do? And my students looked at me and went, huh? Because every method that they thought about in terms of how do you organize, how do you get what you want in a democracy was shut down because of the anti-Black hatred pouring down on Black folk in Mississippi. And then I said, but folk in Mississippi figured it out. They figured out what were their strengths, what were the Achilles heels of the Leviathan, and then they organized. And then they organized, and then they organized, and they took on the Leviathan. Yeah.
So I'm going to go out of order. And that is, we're right at the time for closing, so we don't go over. So I'm going to have the one last question, and it has to be very brief. And then Dr. Anderson will be able to respond also very brief, so we don't go over time. But I want to thank you all, certainly my president for Cypress College, and on behalf of the North Orange County Community College District, Dr. Byron Cliff D. Breland, who is also one of the main parts of why we are all here, funding and facilitating such discussion. The director of Diversity, Culture, and Inclusion, Dr. Flavio Medina Martin Medina, I'm sorry. And I just call him Flavio. And also our faculty fellows, Dr. Annette Letcher, Professor Sergio Banda, and of course, our newest and most esteemed Professor Candace Lim. So myself and also the supporting faculty fellows, Dr. Lenore Cadena and myself at Cypress College, we thank you, and more importantly, Dr. Anderson, for a very informative, as mentioned, and certainly educated presentation. That being said, we're gonna, because it is about students and for students, if you would, what is your question? And then we'll get a very brief but informative answer.
My question isn't really a question. It's just a weird coincidence that my brother met you last night in Memphis at the Facing History event. And through pure sibling rivalry, I just wanted to say that I met you too.
Love it. Love it. Who's your brother?
My brother is a teacher at Memphis High School, and he got you to sign his book for his wife. He has a beard.
Well, we can't end on a better note than that, but I would say he who has last word matters most. So tell him you got him. So Dr. Anderson, thank you again on behalf of North Orange County Community College District, Cypress College as a whole, and the students. Can we give her a nice hand?
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Anderson. Peter Matthews, very nice to be here with you. Thank you so much again.
Thank you. Thank you. Wonderful, wonderful discussion. Thank you.
Well,
you bet.